Welcome to this week's Pascal's China Lens. I'm going to talk about the chip shortages in the world and the role that China plays in it. Are they the cause of it or maybe the solution? And how is that all going, and why are companies or countries chipping in billions of dollars now into the chip industry? What is happening and what does that mean for the future of the world? Now, I know this week has been a special week, a scary week, because the war in Ukraine started. And last week I made a video about that, about this new world order and how China plays a role in that. So a video that really is applicable today to watch again, to understand what China's role into all that and vision and position is. Nothing has changed from my video from last week, so I recommend looking at it. But there's also been some positive things. The Olympic Games stopped and China won 15 medals and they did great, and so that's the only positive note I feel from last week. But today it's really challenging. But I think it's hard to say what is going to happen now in Ukraine and what China's position is. They're kind of tap dancing right now. It's really tough because they're in conflict with their own positioning very often because of their support to Russia and their threat also in a way towards the US. So how are they going to solve it? Let's wait a week or two and I probably will talk more about that then. But for now, I think talking about the chip self-sufficiency, the chip crisis, and how China can solve it or will solve it is the topic I want to talk about today. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, do so now. I have more than 100 videos online and I will continue briefing you about my view or my lens on how China is evolving in the world and the impact it makes on all of us. Since the pandemic started 2 years ago now, we've heard a lot about disruptions into the supply chain of microelectronics, microchips, silicon. It doesn't get into the cars and other products anymore, and we've been waiting sometimes for months on new devices, and for cars, some people have to wait more than a year to get their new car. So all this has to do with a chip shortage. And where did it come from, and has China any fault on it, and can China actually resolve it for the future? Well, let's look a little bit back at what happened. Due to the pandemic, the new demand just soared like crazy. It was like 50% more demand on digital products, whether it was cloud or PCs or cell phones or even cars. Today, the demand picked up again. Everybody wants to buy more electronic devices today than they were in 2019. And so the problem is that the supply cannot follow the demand. This had to do a lot with the pandemic. We all stayed at home. We had time to buy stuff. We also could buy new stuff. We needed stuff for doing home or remote working. And so this all created this disruption due to pandemic COVID-19. But it was also the supply chain, because many factories around the world were stuck, customs were stuck. There was a lot of challenges with the pandemic and specifically with the outbreaks, which means that a lot of containers got stuck very often at ports in Los Angeles. They got stuck for a long time. And so chips is just like any commodity. It's like any product. So if it's in that container, it gets stuck, well, you don't get it. And so that's a big problem. Then of course you had things like the Suez Canal, where the container completely blocked the whole throughput to Europe. And so a lot of these disruptions happened in 2020 and 2021. And then there's something specifically about the stop and start. What it means is that in the industry, very often people at the beginning of the pandemic, many industries, specifically the car industry, they were very worried that the demand would not pick up. And so what they did is they stopped the orders. They stopped ordering chips for new cars because they were worried they wouldn't be able to produce these cars, because people wouldn't buy the cars because you couldn't drive around because many people were back in lockdowns. The issue is that when demand picked up again, well, they had to wait back in the queue. And so people that didn't want the chips before now had to wait for everybody else. And because the demand surged, well, everybody who didn't place their order had to wait for that new demand first. So a real disruption in some industries were really targeted and hit very badly. And then there's been some fatalities, like in Japan there was a fab, a silicon fab that took fire. In Malaysia there were issues. In Taiwan we had the COVID issues that actually stopped TSMC for a while, and so lots of problems because of COVID-19. But COVID-19 is not the only reason why there's a disruption. Actually, the biggest reason why there's a disruption is because before COVID-19, before 2020, there was already an issue in the industry. And the industry had an issue that actually most of the chips are fabricated in Asia. East Asia is fabricating about 75% of all the chips in the world, and that is just in a few factories. It's with Samsung, it's with TSMC, with SMIC in China, and so there's not a lot of these big fat manufacturers. And so when you look at these manufacturers in the East, in Asia, what you see is that Samsung and TSMC, they're going for the really high end, which means high profit margin chips, but lower quantities, but because cell phones need a lot, they still have a lot of quantities, make a lot of money, and that is their focus. While in China, they've been focusing much more on smaller or larger volumes, but smaller margins. And that means like 200 millimeter or 100 millimeter wafers. It also means like 20 or 28 nanometers, not the 14 or 10 nanometers. And so this is a big difference. And so the issue is that over the past years, these factories, which cost billions and billions of dollars to invest in, these fabs were not invested. And so they kept a mentality in the industry of having like an 80% capacity on an average. And this is like the 1920 pork cycle business. I don't know if you know that, but at that time it was like there was an oversupply and an undersupply of pork in the US. That's constantly going above and below like the 80%. So what that means is that as long as you keep at 80%, you can always keep the up and the downward happening. But that means that your factory is actually designed for an 80% capacity. And so when you suddenly have a 50% surge, like we have now, well, you really have a problem and you can't just increase capacity. But the biggest issue is that actually the last years, before Biden, Trump had a real war with China. And so there's two things that created because of this war. One of the things in the chip industry is that SMIC and other companies in China that were fabs, like 28 nanometer and so on, which is most of the chips are not the lowest nanometer, but it's actually more common commodity chips. These chips could not be produced anymore because Trump said you cannot actually buy, or SMIC cannot buy, the new technology from ASML and other manufacturers, which means the machines to produce these chips. And so they could go to 20 nanometer, but they can't go to 10 or 7 or 5 because they don't get the machines anymore. Which means that these companies, many of the companies in the US, suddenly were banned from working with these companies. There were a lot of on the entity list, on the blacklist from the US, which means that they had to go to now TSMC, to Samsung, to Intel in the US to ask for these chips that they normally got from China. And the issue there is that they already were at overcapacity, these other manufacturers. So how are they going to produce for people that they didn't have as customer before, and suddenly new customers flood in? And that is because of Trump's trade war. So this created a lot of tensions and a lot of disruption. The result is also that there's been a lot of hoarding. And that has to do with the Huawei effect. Trump said Huawei cannot get any more chips from the US, not the high-end chips, and so then can't be fabricated or built in Taiwan with TSMC and other places. So what that means is that a lot of these companies in China were starting to hoard these chips. They started to buy millions and millions of chips to make sure they had enough for at least 1 year or 2 years. Huawei did that, many companies did that. But there's also a lot of people that said, well, now is a good time to buy all these chips because the price is going to go up, and that means that I can sell them at a higher price later on. And so this created a price increase on chips, which of course created even more competition in the industry. And so this was a nightmare for the industry, where many big companies, even car manufacturers like Ford and Volvo and a lot of them, could not get the chips because of this whole disruption. And China was at the center of it. Asia, of course, is very important in this whole thing. Now, when we look at the industries and we look at the products, not everybody is hit in the same way. The automotive was hit very badly. And the main reason why automotive was hit badly is simply because they have so many chips in a car. I mean, there's more than 1,000, sometimes 4,000 chips in one car, and so there just has to be one chip that you can't get, and suddenly you can't build a car. And so a friend of mine works at Volvo in Ghent in Belgium, and he's only working like 3 days a week because Fridays and Mondays is closed because they cannot produce enough cars because there's not enough chips. And so most of the industries, most of the devices where there's multiple chips, could be medical devices or any kind of communication device that have more chips in there, like a car, smart devices, these devices were hit very badly. And then there was this big competition between the electronics world, which was going up. Everybody wants a smartphone now, everybody works from home, they want a laptop, they want a camera, they want games, to play games because they have time to play games. That was the pandemic situation. They were fighting, competing against the car manufacturers and the device manufacturers. And so this is where many companies, like even Apple, decide, oh, we're going to focus on the phones, but the laptops we're going to wait a little bit. And so everybody had to make their own decision and do a lot of lobby work. And that is where it created that tension. TSMC specifically was the real issue because they have the most advanced chips. And so that means that unless this company can actually produce a higher capacity, which is now needed 50% more capacity for all devices, well, everything gets stuck. And just one device lacking is actually creating a disruption throughout the whole chain. So this was the problem. And then the other companies that were dealing with China a lot for assembly, they also needed chips. And China is one of the biggest, I mean, it's the biggest importer of chips in the world. Although there's a ban on China for chips, for many of the high-end chips, they're importing more than anybody else, which means if they have a disruption in their supply chain to get the chips, well, it simply means they can't assemble it, they can't build the devices, the drones and the games and all the things that we want from a hardware perspective. And so China became a bottleneck, not because they can't or don't want to build, but simply because they couldn't get the chips, and some of them were banned. And so just one device, one chip, and the whole thing is broken, the whole chain is broken. So it really depends what industry you were in, but everybody was under stress, that's clear. And it will get resolved probably next year. This year will still be very tough, but it's not so easy. So how are they going to resolve it? Well, the whole world, specifically the US, the EU, Asia, they all woke up and suddenly they realized, wow, we are dependent on just a few factories. TSMC in Taiwan, Samsung in Korea, maybe Intel in the US, and SMIC in China, and a few more, and so we're really dependent on these big factories, and so we need to invest more. So what Biden did, he created this big $250 bipartisan tech bill, of which $52 billion will go to the chip industry. Intel is going to get more than half of that probably. They're going to have a new plant in Ohio. It's going to be $100 billion almost investment. I mean, everybody's literally chipping in billions of dollars to create their own independency from an industry point of view. They want to make sure that they are decoupling from that dependency from those few suppliers, specifically those in China. The EU did the same. They started lobbying to get much more money. We're talking about also 20 to 40 billion US dollars investment that they're planning to do in the chip industry. In my country, Belgium, there's a company called IMEC, the top notch when it comes to semiconductors, design and research, and they're going to get lots of money from the European Union normally. Why? Because we need that independency. Same happens with Samsung. They're going to invest 250 billion. TSMC is going to invest 100 billion over the next 3 years. I mean, it's like crazy numbers. China, same thing. In 2021, in 2022, they're investing a lot in new fabs. We're talking about 140 billion in new fabs that are being developed. So everybody's chipping in. Everybody's letting that money roll because they understand. Every country understands that the chip industry is now critical to be more self-sufficient. Now, China has been saying this for many years. They want 70% self-sufficiency on chips. But many other countries now are understanding this is a priority. And so billions are going to roll. But the question is, are we going to use that money effectively, efficiently. Because if you look at the US, I mean, it's all going to go, most of it, to Intel and maybe a few others. I mean, there's a few players, and they're going to focus probably again on the high end. Europe for sure, they want to go up to 2 nanometers, they want to go to the top-notch silicon, same as TSMC. And so what everybody's doing, and many of these countries and many of these big players, is going again into the high quality, top-notch development, research, and the most advanced chips. And that is needed. Why? Because our world has become more complex, everything is digital, and we need these chips like in a smartphone to make it work efficiently. But what we're forgetting is that today it's a much more complex world. It's not all about your smartphone. There's like things like IoT, there's things like connected devices. And so many of these devices before, when you had a toaster or a washing machine, you didn't need a smart chip. Now you need a smarter chip for those devices that are connected, but you still don't need a 2 nanometer chip to make it work. And so who is filling that in? And that's where China comes in. Now what's interesting is that over the past year, 2021, even in 2020, it started really that suddenly China understood with the ban that Trump started on China getting chips and buying chips and importing chips, is that they wanted to really focus on this industry. And the difference with before, where the government said we need to create this industry on chips, is that now suddenly the industry also realized it. In 2021 we had a 33% growth on basically semiconductor output in China. I mean, a huge output, more revenue, more money. SMIC did great business in 2021, so that's why they're investing a few billion again in new fabs. And so everybody in China is now growing in terms of the chip industry. Maybe not the 5 or 7 nanometers, but maybe 20 nanometers, 28 nanometers, 40 nanometers, but that's where they're going. The output is really growing very quickly, and they're starting to gain market share. But the most important thing about the industry now is that this industry in China, it's not just a chip manufacturer that says, I want to become a chip manufacturer, or I want to grow my capacity, like you see with TSMC, with Samsung. No, every technology company in China wants to build or at least design their own chips. Whether they're an internet company, or you see a cloud company, a cell phone company, a car company, every company in China, tech company that is actually successful, is building their own chips. And so they're working together with fabs, they're working together with designers. They want to go to the 5 nanometer designs. They want to make sure that they get their own chips, that they can control themselves, their own future. And so now it's bottom up. And that's the big difference. Where in the West you see that change still being a top-down decision where the big players are making the difference, you now see in China that bottom up, scale-ups, startups, everybody's wanting to be part of that industry. Last year, in 2020, not last year, 2020, there were 32 IPOs. We all know 2021 has been a very tough year on IPOs in China because of the regulation, but 2022 will be back. 32 IPOs in 2020, all in the chip industry. More than $11 billion US dollars were invested as venture capital to startups and scale-ups. So there's lots of money flowing into that industry. And so what I think is happening now is very simple. On the one side, there's the government saying we need to keep that chip race with the rest of the world so we don't become dependent on the high-end chips. And so the really big guys, think about Huawei, these guys are looking together with SMIC and together with new developers to build the next generation chip. But most of the industry is actually focusing on just that other generation that is 1 or 2 behind. 20 nanometers, maybe 10 nanometers over time, 40 nanometers. What that means is that there's a capacity that's being built in China to build really any chip, anything in the world that you need for the connected world of tomorrow. And that is going to change the world of silicon. Why? Because China is now building a platform and connecting all these players together. Just last month, China announced that they will create a new global sourcing platform in Shenzhen. In the greater Bay Area of China, you know, Shenzhen, Macau, Hong Kong, and Guangzhou, that whole area, Guangdong, that area, and it's driven by Beijing. It's by the ministry driven and the National Development and Research Center. So it's really driven by Beijing, but they decided, just like 40 years ago, that Shenzhen would become that new area where everything could open up. Now they're making that open platform for the chip industry. And it's very interesting because they want to not just build a fab. They want to build an ecosystem. They want to build an ecosystem, just as they built an ecosystem around Shenzhen and around Guangzhou when it comes to smart manufacturing. Now it's all about building smart factory or chip factory. And so it will leverage anybody who wants to purchase chips from anywhere in China or around the world. Because this is a platform where you can buy raw materials, you can buy chips, electronics, sensors, and sensors is interesting because that's going into all the IoT devices in the world, but it's also a place where talent and support will be provided to make that platform work. When it comes to talent, it's about bringing smarter people in that area to support designs of chips, create more IP, create more chips in itself, create more fabs. Anybody who can contribute to building that ecosystem will be welcome in that area. And tax-wise will be doing very well because China is supporting that growth. But it's also about support. And that's about import and export. And so China is looking at its logistics and how they can help actually make sure that anything in that region that needs to be imported or exported in the chip industry, for any industry, whether it's car industry or the PC industry, they want to make it sure that it's fast and it's efficient. And that is going to be the support that they're going to do. Most likely blockchain is going to be part of it to make sure it's secure and efficient as well going through customs. And then there's the innovation part. They want to create this innovation area. It's already the center of innovation for China when it comes to combining hardware and software. Shenzhen is definitely. But now they want to do that around the chip industry. Of course, this is a long shot, but I believe that this idea is actually the way to go. It's not about building a new fab. It's not about building more capacity. That is, of course, needed as well. It is about building hundreds and thousands of companies that all work together and all have their part to play. This is not about control, this is not about centralized, this is about a decentralized environment. Which is kind of a paradox almost, or really strange to say, that China is looking at a decentralized system in this industry, while the rest of the world is looking at centralized system in this industry. And so what I think is going to happen in the IoT world of tomorrow, or the Industry 4.0 world that we talk about, is that now you will need hundreds of billions of chips every year to be shipped around the world to make all the devices work. And you will need that specifically to reach the climate goals, because that's the way to measure everything. You will need it for all the smart devices. More and more people will want smart devices because work has changed and the whole way of living has changed. And what it means is that the high-end chips, you will still be able to get them from TSMC, from Samsung, from Intel, from Nvidia, from all these top players in the world. But the 90% of the chips that are needed to make that connected smart world work, these chips will come from China. And so they're building a whole ecosystem, a whole new industry, where the whole country, the whole tech world, is revolving around building and creating chips. And also shipping them and creating platform and support for it. And so it's going to be very difficult in the future to decouple from China in the chip industry, not because we don't have an alternative, but because China has everything. And just like with the cars, when you have thousands of sensors and thousands of chips in your car, you only need a few that you can't get and you can't produce your car. And this is where China will get the power over the world in the chip industry to make sure that everything keeps working. And so we're going to somehow have to figure out a way to trust China. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck with some chips that we can't get because China has started to get a monopoly because of its size and its scale of number of companies that are working as a new factory or chip factory of tomorrow's world.